Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. We are a couple of days into the spring transfer portal window officially being open. I'll get up here on a Thursday afternoon and say Dan Lanning in the Oregon Ducks, to me, are one of the biggest winners we've seen so far. And I think there are a lot of Oregon fans looking at me like, look at this idiot getting up here talking about Oregon being a winner in the spring transfer portal window. They haven't landed a commitment yet. Yeah, I think that's fair. The reason I consider them a winner is they've lost one scholarship player so far in the first 48 hours. I would be I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a few more names enter the transfer portal for this Oregon team, but I think it's very clear early on in the process that there's not going to be much attrition from this Oregon roster in the spring transfer portal window. That was priority number one. You make no mistake about it. This Oregon team, from a pure talent standpoint, it's one of the most talented programs that we see across the country. There are guys in the two deep, in the three deep, legitimately in the three deep on this Oregon roster that would start at other Power Four programs. And the fact that Oregon has only lost one name so far that's a scholarship player, whatever Dan Lanning is doing with this program, something's right with it. And Dan Lanning and Oregon, they get a lot of heat, on the message boards on Twitter from the national media about using the transfer portal too much and potentially over recruiting the young talent that they have on their roster. Yeah, Dan Lanning has used the portal very successfully at times. Guys don't seem to leave this program. And so when I'm evaluating Oregon early on in the spring transfer portal window, I was much less concerned with the names that they were going to go after, because the pure truth of it, in the spring transfer portal window, there's not going to be that many names that enter their name into the portal that would help this Oregon team in 2025. I was much more concerned with, hey, how many players is Oregon going to lose during the spring portal window? And again, there could be a few names that trickle their way in over the next couple of days. But as we sit here 48 hours in, Oregon's lost one scholarship guy in Roderick Pleasant, who I got a ton of respect for, and a guy that I was a big fan of when we broke down his commitment when he committed to Oregon in that 2023 cycle. But at the end of the day, this tells me a lot more about the young defensive backs on this team. Guys like Iffy, guys like Naheem Offord, guys like Brandon Finney. This is telling me that the Oregon defensive back room, if you are squeezing Roderick Pleasant out of this roster, tells me you got some guys in this room going into 2025. Now, I want to talk about some potential positions that Oregon might look to go at. Want to talk about a few players, and we're going to have some fun with this one. We're going to talk about two players that are currently in the portal that I think would maybe make sense for Oregon to go after. We're going to talk about two players that they're not in the portal right now, but man, if they were to go into the portal and you're hearing some loose buzz that they might be, I think would be good targets for Oregon. Now, before we get into it, as always, to the Oregon fans, appreciate you guys. I think this one's going to be a fun one. Kind of a midway spring practice check-in, talking about where on this roster Oregon might want to try to solidify going into 2025. Y'all let it fly in the comment section. The amount of support y'all have shown the boys over the last couple of weeks as we've talked spring practice, been amazing. Can't thank you guys enough. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. Now, Roderick Pleasant transferring out. I think this has to do with two things. One, there's a lot of talent in this defensive back room. We've been saying it all spring. I don't know what the official starting lineup's going to look like for Oregon in the back end. Dylan Tiedemann and it sounds like Iffy are the two guys that we feel pretty confident are going to be starters. But man, the talent and depth is kind of on another level. And I think Oregon is there's probably a little bit of, hey, Oregon's looking for a little bit more size. I don't think it's a coincidence that you look at the last couple of defensive backs Oregon has brought in on the high school trail. Guy like Iffy in 2024, guy like Brandon Finney and Naheem Offord and Dorian Barney in the 2025 class. I don't think it's a coincidence that those are all big, long athletes. I think Oregon is looking for a little bit more size in the secondary. And Roderick Pleasant, good football player, lightning fast football player. I'm talking 10-1 in the 100-meter dash, probably lacks the size that Oregon's looking for in the back end of this defense. Now, let's get into a few names that are in the portal that it's not necessarily a need for Oregon, but guys that I think would help this Oregon roster. And I want to start with Bo Atkinson. This guy is my darling of the spring transfer portal window. Now, he's getting a lot of SEC buzz. And let's be very clear, Oregon does not need much help on the edge. I mean, you got Tatum and Mateo going into year 3. You're hearing great things about a guy like Elijah Rushing going into year 2. You have Blake Purchase, who I think would start on a decent amount of Power 4 teams. The edge position for Oregon is in a very good spot. Bo Atkinson would make it better. I don't know if he would start over Mateo and Tatum, but he's a guy that would be in the 2 deep, and he would be a guy that, one, he's very good stopping the run, 17 run stops last year, 15% pass rush win rate. It's an NFL guy. And you look at Oregon, one of the things that we've been talking about all offseason, hey, how do we go from good to great? Depth on the defensive line is a priority. Now, I think you have the depth, especially at the edge position, but this is one of the few guys that I look at currently in the portal and say, this would help. This player would play for Oregon and he would help him. And quite frankly, just not saying it for that many players in the spring transfer portal window so far. Another name to monitor is Andrew Simpson from Boise State. One of those guys that, look, Oregon is probably a little bit thin in the linebacker room, is probably looking for maybe a little bit more experience and depth. I would be surprised if Andrew Simpson came into. I would be surprised if Andrew Simpson comes to Oregon because I don't think he starts over Betcher and Devin Jackson. But he's a guy that could help your depth and a guy that probably helps your team going into 2025. Now the conversation is, and this is the fun conversation, right? We talk about 2 names in the portal that maybe could help Oregon, and really those are really only a few names that kind of pop to me that I think would help. Let's talk about some fun names to watch. Some names that I don't want to spread any fake news, if you will, because these names are not in the portal. I have no reason to believe that they're imminently going to be in the portal. Man, if there was one guy that I could choose to go into the portal that I could choose to just place on this Oregon team, it's Raylan Wilson from Georgia. I think he's one of the most talented linebackers in the country in a linebacker room that is absolutely loaded. And there's no doubt Dan Lanning played a role in recruiting Raylan Wilson to Georgia during his time at Georgia. He's going into year 3. Oregon needs if there's one thing I think Oregon could really benefit from going into 2025, it is a All-American caliber linebacker. I love Betcher. I think he's going to be a very good linebacker for Oregon. I like Devin Jackson, and Devin Jackson's ceiling is really high. We kind of need him to reach that ceiling in 2025, but the ceiling is extremely high for that kid. Raylan Wilson would come in and say, hey, what's the one thing that we saw Oregon maybe struggle with at times at their linebacker spot? Speed and space, run and chase ability. You saw at times, especially against Ohio State said, hey, we don't think your defense at the second level is fast enough to kind of run and tackle us in space. And they went to work. Raylan Wilson, 6'1", 225. He's a little bit of a smaller linebacker. This kid flies around to the football. He not only ran a 10.91 in the 100-meter dash coming out of high school. So he has that straight line speed, but the difference between Raylan Wilson and kind of where Devin Jackson is, Devin Jackson's really fast in a straight line, doesn't necessarily play the fastest right now. Now, he could take a massive stride in 2025, but in terms of diagnosing what's in front of him and being quick to kind of diagnose it and run and chase and tackle, there's still some room for development. Raylan Wilson is that guy. And I think Oregon could probably benefit from having a true All-American caliber off-ball linebacker. And Georgia's got, 5, 6 linebackers that are going to go play in the league over the next couple of years. Is Raylan Wilson potentially looking for a new spot where he can get a little bit more playing time, or maybe just, again, I don't know if Raylan Wilson wants to leave Georgia, but this one would be very fun. And then another one that you've actually seen some smoke around is Darrell Jackson. And Oregon, when they have the opportunity to add a big body in the middle of the defensive line, they will do it every single time. They landed Derek Harmon in the spring transfer portal window, and that revolutionized their defense in 2024. Derek Harmon was probably the biggest key, maybe outside of Mateo, and I would say Derek Harmon was the most important player on that defense. You feel great about a lot. Amari Washington, Bear Alexander. You feel good about the guys going into year two. Daryl Jackson's a big athletic body that is arguably one of the most physically gifted defensive linemen we see. This could be a potential name that maybe hits the portal that Oregon would pursue. Again, my take on it right now is that Oregon's winning, man. If Oregon just loses Roderick Pleasant and doesn't make a single addition in the spring portal window, I would consider them a winner. I mean, with the amount of talent that Oregon has and they're 2 and 3 deep, keeping all these guys in Eugene is huge. Now, we could see maybe a guy like Jurion Dickey hit the portal. We'll see. But as of right now, the way Oregon is able to acquire all this talent and also retain the talent they want to keep, it is incredibly impressive to me. We'll see. And hey, Dan Lanning, when the opportunity presents itself to make his team better, he is going to pursue it. As of right now in the spring portal window, I haven't seen that many players that would make Oregon significantly better. But if that opportunity does arise, we'll talk about it. We'll break down the commitments. But as we sit right now, liking what I'm seeing from Oregon, keep on retaining that talent. We got spring game coming up in a week that I'm fired up about. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.